Shooting it raw?
Yes, shooting it raw. Well, okay, so my strengths don't lie in photography. So I guess it's breaking a little from the mold of this podcast a little today. But what I've brought along to share with you is 4 charts or 4 visualizations, I guess, from my book, which I published last year called Climate Change and the Road to Net Zero, which I think tell the story of the whole book. And so I'm sort of trained as a scientist originally, and following that, spent 10 years as an investment banker. So data is incredibly important to me. And sort of every statement that I make in the book is backed up by facts and figures and references. But I also know that many people aren't particularly turned on by data or boring facts and figures and charts as they see it, which is why I think sort of data visualizations and engaging writing are as equally important as the sort of data and the analytics. And I think that's that in a way is kind of a form of photography. It's sort of capturing the essence of what you're seeing or what you want to say in one image. And I think that's particularly important for the topic that we're going to discuss today, which is climate change and getting to net zero across the world, which is it's a very complex and overwhelming subject and there's lots of misinformation out there. So being able to present and show people in a simple way what you want to explain or say, I think is incredibly important. You could be the best scientist in the world, but if nobody's listening to you, then there's kind of no point, right? So it's all about engaging the audience, and just as a great photo captures that essence and translates it to the audience, so I want the visualizations in my book to take that data, take that information, and tell a simple story to the reader. So I'm hoping we dig into those charts today.
Mathew, Hampshire. Okay, how do I say your? Okay, I can say Mathew is fine. Hampshire-Waugh, is that right? Right, Hampshire-Waugh.
Hampshire-Waugh, yeah, that's
Hampshire-Waugh.
The one. Double barrel.
Right.
Yes.
All right. Yeah, I'll do some Hampshire-Waugh. Mathew. Okay. Boom. Okay, so Mathew, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It's called Shooting It Raw, so it's raw. It's whatever we think, and in a way, like, there's a format which is good to follow, but I like the fact that I think I went back to you a couple of times saying, well, you have listened to the podcast. You're like, yeah, I know. But I want to send these graphics. I'm like, yeah, but, okay, sure, why not? Let's just do it. Yes.
If I'd sent you my photography, given the skills that I have, I don't think you would have had me on the podcast.
Hey, you know what? Here's actually a very good point, and you touched on it. It's kind of like, okay, so the photograph is it's a record, ultimately, of wavelengths. So it's a digital or it's a film record of either light hitting either a sensor or hitting like photo emulsion. And there's no such thing as black and white. There's no such thing as red and green. There's just what our brains interpret as that. And if we pull back even more, we have signifiers and signified. So an image is a signifier. And so maybe a photo of a landscape signifies, romance or whatever it is. But in this case, you sent me 3 charts and the cover of your book, which we're going to dive into. And I love it. I like, why aren't these, you know what? This fits the format. This is great. I love it.
I'll bend the rules a little bit.
Of course. I hope so. Okay, so let's dive into your first, okay?
Yeah, no problem.
History of human progress. It's actually a very, I don't want to say endearing, but it's a very, like, an eye-catching graphic in the sense that it's a graph with a y and an x-axis. And by the way, bring in the data. I love it. On the y-axis, you have energy plus knowledge increasing. And on the x-axis, you have basically years going back in the past, where the zero, the beginning, is 4 million, then 2 million, then 50,000, then 10,000, then 5,000, 2,000, 500 years ago, 300 years ago, 200 years, 50 years ago, until now. And up in this kind of whimsical, arrows kind of going up and down, kind of almost like a ladder, just kind of increasing over time. We see various entries, which I think you'll discuss. So let me give it. So what am I looking at?
Yeah, so this first chart, and bearing in mind the challenge for this chart, what I wanted to do was to sum up all of human history in one chart, which had to be in black and white and would fit on the page of an A5 book.
Easy.
So that's a bit of a challenge, right? That's a bit of a challenge.
Nice.
So to rewind a little, think about actually, why I wanted to put this chart together, and this whole journey for me has been about climate change. And so I've spent the last 2 years writing this book on climate change, and I did it because I wanted to explore all sides of the climate debate. So so I'm not a hardened environmentalist. So I enjoy nature as much as the next person, but I live in a city. I don't have a particularly strong affinity to nature. But I wanted to kind of approach this climate topic, which is very controversial on both sides, and I wanted to approach it with no preconceived bias. I just wanted to explore all avenues and arguments. How big an issue is climate change? How does it compare with other global problems? Is there a workable solution? What's it going to cost? Is it worth doing? Or are we better off spending our money somewhere else? And if we're going to do something, how quickly do we need to act? And why is it such a challenging problem? And I quickly realized that you just can't start making predictions about the future of humanity without first considering the past. So how did our Earth come to be like it is today? How has climate changed in the past? What role have humans played in this? What arguments have there been, and what arguments are still being waged today on both sides of the coin on all of these topics? So if you start getting stuck into this, you start getting into arguments about are there limits to human growth or limits to human progress? Is progress or growth a good thing, or is it a bad thing? Do we have a moral responsibility because we're the smartest creatures on this planet, or should we just get on with it and do what we want? So I wanted to start understanding how we got here as a species, so we could reflect on that through the book. So this chart, it goes back 4 million years, which is roughly the first human ancestors. And over that period, that's a period where basically the global population has grown from basically 2 to 8 billion people. And as you start piecing together human progress throughout all of this time, you start to realize that there's basically this virtuous circle sort of driving progress between what may be a really small, maybe insignificant or serendipitous discovery, which leads to slightly more surplus energy. And when you have this extra energy, that gives you a little bit more time on your hands because you don't have to look for as much food or fuel. And so you've got a bit more time on your hands. And when you've got a bit more time on your hands, that gives you time to start improving processes and what eventually became known as technology. So that leads to more efficient ways of doing things, but also more efficient ways of recording and transferring knowledge through the generations. So this virtuous circle is more energy, more efficiency, more knowledge. And so what this chart is summarizing is all of these key kind of discoveries and changes throughout human history, which expanded our access to energy and expanded our recorded knowledge base that could get passed on through the generations. So beyond just kind of our biological, what we pass on through our DNA, we can also supplement that with knowledge written in books and things. There's lots of examples we could pick out on there. Let's start with the first one. So one of the earliest breakthroughs for humans was fire and cooking. So our earliest ancestors, 3 or 4 million years ago, well, they relied on their hands as their primary means of production, and on the power of the sun to grow plants to provide food for energy, so that they could sustain life. But it's pretty inefficient because plants capture about 1% of the sun's energy. Humans only convert about 25% of that energy of those food calories into kind of useful work. So basically, humans were spending all their energy hunting and gathering for more food, and it left very little spare time to figure out how to do things better.
Can I just interrupt for a little bit because so this isn't you ain't my first rodeo, so you know what I mean, like in terms of like just for example, 1 hour is going to go by so fast because it's a
Yeah,
conversation. So just so that you understand just where I'm coming from, right? So the
yeah,
past 15 years, the work I've done has been to look at what we've ended up calling like human advancement. And in a
yeah,
way, the stuff I've been doing, there's a kind of a connection to what you're saying as well, because what you've plotted really is this interrelation between, I guess, technology and human advancement on a survival level. So I assume you've read Guns, Germs, and Steel by what's his name? The author's name. Very, very famous book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. He kind of talks a little bit about what you're talking about, but not from the climate perspective. So
yeah,
if we were to be able to compress all, because it's a very rich visualization that people can look at, if we're going to
yeah.
compress that into a shorter sort of thing, how would you present this in a sort of a shorter kind of version?
I guess to describe this chart, I mean, you can basically track human progress from our first ancestors who unlocked more energy by using fire and tools and cooking to break down food, make it easier to digest, and so we could take on more calories. And this progress then just continued on. So that led to a bit more time. That meant that they could establish art and language, I guess,
Yeah.
which then it took millions of more years of incremental, pretty slow progress. You come to things like the agricultural revolution, which
Mm-hmm.
boosted food production again per capita because we were tending the land rather than hunting or gathering.
Mm-hmm.
The Sumerians in modern day Iraq, they developed early writing and accounting. So
Right.
again, that helped the knowledge base and disseminating like information, and we started creating those larger sort of social organizational structures. Then you had the scientific revolution, which helped with things like shipbuilding and navigation, which opened up trade around the world, boosting efficiencies across the globe in all regions. But I think one big thing I took away from this is that despite all this amazing progress, up until about 300, 200, 300 years ago, most energy was still just supplied by people,
Mm-hmm.
animals, wood,
Yeah.
maybe wind or water wheels. So progress had been pretty linear. And it wasn't really until we developed the steam engines and unleashed the power of fossil fuels that progress became exponential, right?
Sure.
And so if you look at this chart and you look at a chart plotted of kind of GDP per capita, or your average income of your average human being put into today's money, for most of human history, your average human earned about $1,000 per year in
Right.
the equivalent of today's money. Up until about 200 years ago, and then suddenly that's ballooned to now today it's $18,000 per
Right.
person per year.
Yeah.
And if you plot energy use and knowledge, they do exactly the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So you had all of this change for 4 million years, but for most of that time, it was pretty linear and pretty slow. And as production and technology improved, so did the number of human beings.
Yeah.
So the average, even though life was very different, the average sort of well-being of your average human stayed pretty much the same up until we unleashed fossil fuels on the world,
Mm-hmm.
basically.
Okay. Okay. Clear. Great. Okay. So do you want to use that as the segue to the next image?
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
So this one is called, I guess, 500 million years of CO2 and temperature. So it's a graph, another graph. On the left, you have parts per million of CO2, and on the x-axis, you have million years ago, thousands of years ago, and hundreds of years ago, and roughly plotting, I guess, parts per million of CO2. Okay.
Yeah, so
So
parts per
explain
million
this chart.
CO2 is that. Yeah, so you can see the parts per million CO2 is the dotted line,
Mm-hmm.
and temperature change, so above an average period between the year 1850 and 1900,
Mm-hmm.
is the solid line, and that's basically temperature. So all we're plotting here is temperature change versus parts per million, so that's concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we're doing it back for 500 million years.
Right.
So again, what I found when coming to look at all of this stuff is that I could find a chart of CO2 measurements and temperature going back 70 years.
Right.
Or I could find different charts going back maybe 1,000 years. Or I could find, one going back maybe 100 million years, but then not giving the detail on the kind of later period.
Sure.
So what I wanted to do was just take in one image, just show the relationship between how much CO2 there is in the atmosphere. And
Mm-hmm.
CO2 is obviously a greenhouse gas, which scientists understand warms the planet, and what the temperature of Earth was at that point.
Mm.
So this chart very simply shows you that for 500 million years, temperature and CO2 have basically moved in unison.
Right.
You shift one, the other will follow.
Sure.
Okay. And at the moment, we are adding, you can see at the very end of that chart on the
Mm-hmm.
right there, you can see that big uptick in the dotted line.
Yep.
So through most of building human civilization for the last 10 to 15,000 years since the agricultural revolution, concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere have been at around 280 parts per million.
Right.
In the last 100 years, really, that's pushed up to now over 410 parts per million. That's
Right.
gone up very, very quickly.
Yeah.
In fact, there's no that pace of change is pretty much unknown throughout this 500 million year history.
Wow. Wow.
And you can see that the solid line there is starting to follow.
Mm-hmm.
So temperatures are already pushed 1 degree C higher. They will continue to follow that, basically that trajectory of CO2 increases.
Mm-hmm.
It's to give you an idea of what's going to happen beyond this. The last time the CO2 was at the levels it is today, if you look back in time, so you can just literally draw a sort of parallel line back through that chart through
Sure.
the years from the top of the end of the dotted line.
Mm-hmm.
You'll see you have to go back 3 to 4 million years ago.
Yeah.
When temperatures were about 3 to 4 degrees C hotter.
Right.
This point, there was no ice in the Arctic,
Mm-hmm.
and sea levels, average sea levels around the world, were 20 meters higher.
Right.
And remember, at that point, humans were pretty much yet to evolve.
Sure.
So we're already at a pretty staggering concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and Earth's temperatures are starting to catch up to that.
I want to interrupt for a second. So you are working as a stockbroker, and
Yeah.
what were you like as a kid? What got you going?
So I've always been, I guess, into science.
Yeah.
So I always loved science as a kid, and just trying to understand the world and what makes things tick.
Sure.
So I kind of, I carried that through university, and I did chemistry, and then I went on to do a PhD.
Oh wow.
In UCL, University College London, in materials science.
Oh wow.
So I actually applied for 2 PhDs.
Okay.
Because
you're
the
like an
first one was
underachiever, right?
I try. So the first PhD actually was like pure science, like pure kid stuff. and you ask about me as a kid, it was in metamaterials.
Okay.
So these are basically very nano-structured, so like
Okay.
billionth of a meter materials, which are structured in a certain way, which can bend light the wrong way.
Okay.
And
Okay.
when you can bend light the wrong way, you can curve light around objects.
Right.
So the idea was to make a Harry Potter cloak or
Right.
a Star Trek cloaking device.
Sure.
Unfortunately, I didn't get that one. Someone picked me to it.
Mm-hmm.
So the second one was looking at basically nanomaterials used to kind of enhance solar panels, so to
Right.
boost the
Right.
efficiency of solar panels
Okay.
by kind of scattering light, so they could collect up more light as it hits them.
Mm-hmm.
Or also looking at making windows in buildings essentially mimic the greenhouse effect.
How do
So
you
the
go from
greenhouse effect.
studying this to go in stock picking? Like that's a bit of a jump. Like what?
Yeah, no, it is a jump, and
Is it because of
maybe a
the
move to the
math?
dark side.
Is it because of the math? What is it? Why? How did that happen?
So basically, I finished my PhD, and I was thinking about staying on and trying to do a postdoc, eventually a lecturer, but it's very slow.
Yeah.
And once you've done science for 7 years, you realize it's not about eureka moments. It's
No.
about kind of doing an experiment 100 times, and
Yep.
at the end of it, you've figured out 100 ways how not to do something.
Right.
So, and I'm an impatient person.
No.
So I was like, well, what can I do?
Wait, stop. Sir, I take offense. You are not, no, I will, no, you are not an impatient person. Dude, you finished a PhD. That is a lonely road. That is a hard road. But what I find fascinating is that you're like, I could do the professor thing, the research thing, but shit, I want a nice car, baby. I want a nice house. I'm going to go into stocks.
Yeah, no, look, that played. My wife works in finance, so she kind of got me interested in it.
Oh, okay.
But I was like, hey, I want to carry on this stuff. This is what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
Can it be something more fast paced and more immediate?
Got it.
And so I ended up on the chemicals team at a Credit Suisse, so a global investment bank, where I was an equity analyst.
Okay.
So basically, I followed 20, 30 companies, and you forecast, how much cash they're going to make.
Mm-hmm.
You value the stock, and then you go to pension funds and hedge funds and institutional investors.
What's interesting,
and you tell them to buy or sell it.
Yeah, but in the meantime, in the background, what's simmering in your subconscious is the material science, and obviously the impulse to focus your intellectual energy or attention shifts over to climate science. And so let's go back to your chart then, because I find it, I love it. So you go, so this particular graph.
Let me just finish. Let me just finish on that point.
Go for it.
So the bank, it basically took a couple of years figuring out how the job works.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, I want to get back into what I'm interested in. So I made sure that I was covering all the companies doing new energy stuff.
Okay.
So this is what really got me into further into all of this. So,
yes.
Companies that make materials for batteries for electric cars, or enzymes to make bioethanol for biofuels.
I love it.
Or the people making polysilicon for solar panels.
Yeah.
And that became my USP. And I would build these big models integrating all kind of the economics and the science and the technology together.
Oh, wow.
Which is really the kind of the early blueprint for the book.
Fantastic. Okay, so when you say you decided to put together this graph, this sort of, okay, let's look at the history, in terms of the correlation or relationship between temperature and CO2 concentrations, and this goes back to 500 million years. This graph truly doesn't exist somewhere?
Yeah. So the I can't remember this one. So this was kind of plotted on separate axes.
Okay.
But it was incredibly difficult to find.
Right.
And all I did is they had collated like hundreds of papers to put this together.
Right.
So no, don't get me wrong. This is not an original piece of data work. I'm not a climate scientist. I just spent hours and days trawling through the internet trying to find this chart,
Well,
because
to curate
this to
it.
me is the key chart,
Yeah,
right?
to find
I
it.
don't want to see just back 50 years. I don't want to see back 1,000 years.
Yeah.
I want to see through all of time that we can measure and monitor,
Yeah.
whether directly or indirectly. I want to see how temperature and CO2 change,
Right.
because that for me is irrefutable proof
Sure.
that the two follow one another.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like when you combine that with the fact that there is a scientific theory to explain it, that's when you go, hey, you can't deny this stuff. You
Mm-hmm,
cannot
mm-hmm,
deny that
mm-hmm.
CO2 increases temperatures. It
But
also works the other way around, by the way.
right.
If temperatures increase, that also leads to an increase in CO2,
Right. Right.
or vice versa.
The data don't lie.
The data doesn't lie.
Yeah.
And so stick that in a chart, and then we'll stick on some key moments in human history and Earth
Right.
history, and that gives you a very good appreciation of where we have been for 500 million years, and
Yeah.
basically then where we're going to. So that's what's important from this. So
Mm-hmm.
we're 8 billion people on this planet now. We're going to rise to over 10 billion people, most
Right.
probably. And everybody rightfully wants to increase consumption towards the highest standard of living.
Sure.
We're very unequal around the world at the
Right.
moment. There are lots of emerging countries who rightfully want to bring up the standard of living, which means consuming more energy.
Yeah.
And if we don't change the system, that means emitting more CO2.
Mm-hmm.
So at the minute, we emit about 50 billion tons a year. That'll grow to about 100 billion tons per year. That little dotted line there will creep up to about 1,000 parts per million by the start of the next century if we
Yeah.
don't do something about this.
And for those who can't
Plot that
see,
back again,
yeah.
and you have to go back to the dinosaurs,
Yeah,
basically.
50 million years ago.
10 degrees C warmer, no ice on Earth. Sea levels were 200 meters higher at that
Oh,
point,
wow.
and you had 200-pound penguins waddling around New Zealand.
Hmm.
And obviously the temperature of the Earth takes time to catch up
Sure.
to the parts per million CO2. So that doesn't all happen in the next 100 years, but
Right.
that gives you an idea of where you're headed, very roughly.
Mathew, yes, convincing. Well, it's compelling. Okay. So this, let's just say it's more qualitative and less quantitative, in the sense that you've got human prosperity plotted against, it's not really clear what the x-axis would be, but so you've
This
got
is just sort of time through the x-axis, yeah.
Okay, so you've got like sort of one area is like tipping point risk with minimal adaptation or failed climate engineering, which is a mouthful, but you're going to explain this. You've got this area which is fossil fuel, and that's the thing about, there's a real phobia, or now a kind of this revulsion or this anger or this disgust pushed onto even just the notion of fossil fuel. Yet to have a clear appreciation of the problem, we also need to have a good literacy about how much our societies depend on this easy to access fossil fuel that is quite dirty, and it's quite, we're not very efficient at collecting it, but it's certainly pulled us out of the mud. We've got no climate change, which is one of the arrows, and above that we have lower cost and less damages. They look less like areas and more like themes or ideas that all sit beneath the very well written out net zero. So please explain, what am I looking at?
So I just wanted to sum up the end message of the book, and this chart kind of gets built up through the book. So we're looking at every aspect of it. So you're coming into this cold, so you're not going to understand certain bits and pieces of it, but we're going to talk through it now.
Sure.
But I think, let's first of all start with your point. Sometimes fossil fuels are seen as the enemy. I don't see fossil fuels as the enemy, because what we were talking about at the start, we said that for most of human history, your average human basically was no better off for millions of years, up until along came fossil fuels 200 or 300 years ago. And we unlocked this huge energy surplus. It gave us loads of time to improve technology, to build civilization, and to basically establish this enormous knowledge base, this human knowledge base. which has led us to do amazing things. And if you look through this couple of 100-year period, things like life expectancy has doubled, battlefield deaths have declined 20-fold, child mortality, well, that's fallen from 43 to 4%. Extreme poverty is gone from 90% to 10%, right? It's been, by most measures, it's been hugely beneficial uh, for humans as a species. But of course, at the same time, it's putting pressure on the planet.
Yeah.
So I don't see fossil fuels as the enemy. I see them as having given us this opportunity to build our knowledge base. And after doing all this work on the book and figuring out, how exactly can what's it going to cost to solve climate change? How can we do it? You basically realize that we already have nearly everything that we need to solve climate change and avoid the worst warming outcomes, whilst also, by the way, solving air pollution, which is the second biggest killer in the world today. So that's a big co-benefit. But you can do it, and it'll be cheaper than the equivalent fossil fuel system.
Okay.
So, a net zero world will be built around an energy supply that's mainly comes from wind and solar. And because the sun doesn't shine all the time, the wind doesn't blow all the time, what you have to do is connect up different grids and put in some storage. So that's things like batteries or water reservoirs.
Yeah.
But if you look at the cost of wind solar batteries, every time that they double in terms of installed sites, the cost of producing them declines by 10 to 35%.
Okay.
So most people look at the cost of climate change just through time and then just put in sort of just guessed assumptions as to what the cost of solar or wind or whatever it might be will be in X year in the future.
Right.
What I realized is that's pointless. What you need to do is say, hey, these costs are going to shrink with scale of production.
Yep.
And once you do it that way, you realize that the end game is going to be cheaper than the fossil fuel equivalent. And so that was really a breakthrough moment for me in this analysis. So, the cost comes down so quickly. And at the same time, when you're supplying all your energy by wind and solar and electricity, you have to electrify everything in the economy. So like electric cars, electric heat pumps for houses instead of gas boilers, things like that. Generally, electric stuff is way more efficient. So you can provide all the same like travel, goods, food, amenities, and you can do it by using half as much energy.
Yeah.
And that energy is getting a lot cheaper because of the scale of production.
Right.
So for me, it became, net zero is a win-win for both the environment, but also the economy.
In your brain, in your intellectual development, in how you got to writing this book and expressing yourself to me is all these little experiences that have been formed by your education and by your sort of just gathering all this information, and it just building this expertise in your head, right? So somebody who has not zero, but who has a much, much smaller foundation in the basics that you have, may see that gap of like, when you say net zero, maybe it's important to also explain what you mean, because I understand what you mean, or at least I think I understand what you mean. But what is the vision of that net zero idea or future? Like, how do you see that future?
Yeah. So maybe we need to define net zero first, right? So net zero is essentially means it means that human emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases which cause global warming, the amount that we're putting into the atmosphere, let's say every year, is offset by a similar amount that we are actively drawing down. So net, it's zero.
Right.
So that could either mean just eliminating all CO2 emissions in the first place, or greenhouse gas emissions in the first place, or it could practically mean reducing those emissions as far as we can, and then finding ways to draw that CO2 back out of the atmosphere so we are net zero.
Okay.
And that means, if you stop adding CO2 to the atmosphere, it stops building up in the atmosphere. It plateaus, and eventually it'll start drawing down because of natural processes. And that basically limits global warming to what we hope will be safe levels, which has been deemed by the International Panel on Climate Change at around kind of 1.5 to 2 degrees increase, and we're
Sure.
already just over 1 degree C increase.
Yeah. Like, okay, so in terms of the development of your book, how did so you because you have the experience of writing a book, which is the grand thesis, right? So your PhD
Yeah.
thesis is essentially, okay, I'm going to work on this book for 4 or 5 years, and here it is, present it, well done. Now, as far as this book is concerned, how did it manifest? I know you say, well, I had this, I'm learning about it through my work, but then I decided I want to start articulating it into a kind of a narrative or a kind of a text, right? So
Yeah.
why do you feel that a book is the way to capture that collection of ideas and material?
So for me, how did it come? I guess it came about just so working at the investment bank. Well, my MO became new energy, looking at new energy type things, but also looking at complete integrated kind of supply chains. So what I mean by that is, for instance, if I was looking at battery materials or batteries going into electric cars, I don't just look at that little subset. I look at everything. I look at combustion engines, all of the stuff that's going into building up cars, the whole supply chain, how it all integrates. And I would kind of build these big models and get everybody from around the bank involved,
Mm-hmm.
and then try and figure out the path of the way the world was going to move based on social pressures, based on regulation, based on economics. And that's how I got interested in building these kind of big, what are called integrated models.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but ultimately, I got kind of tired of going sort of head to head with managing directors in the US in oil and gas who would just flat out tell me, no, you can't put that in. Oil demand is never going to peak; it's going to keep growing forever.
Right.
I'm like, well, okay, guys, come on, let's have a conversation about this.
Right, right.
And so I kind of felt like I'd taken it as far as I could at an investment bank.
Sure.
And I was like, well, I want to do this, but I want to do it on my own. I want it to be my hopefully non-biased view.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to do it for everything. So
Right.
I want the science, the technology, the economics, the politics of everything all mapped together. And
Okay.
that's really what the book was about.
Right.
And you say writing a PhD thesis is hard. That was a walk in the park compared to piecing this book together, right?
Okay. Okay. That's interesting. I think this particular graphic here, which is I'd say the when I see the one of where human prosperity and then net zero and tipping point risk, and in a way there are many things going on in this graphic, right? So what is the one thing people need to remember about this graph?
Yeah. So that line in the middle that says no climate change, right? Imagine
Right.
if climate change didn't exist, and human prosperity just kept on increasing through this
Right.
virtuous circle that we talked about first, right? Then let's see the two paths that we could take. Well, we could continue just using fossil fuels,
Okay.
and
Okay.
the system would continue to expand. Um, Maybe we could, if we could successfully engineer the climate.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is there's various options that you could look at in terms of blocking the sun's energy entering Earth using mirrors in space, or making clouds whiter
Yeah.
um, to limit global warming. But they don't solve problems like acidification of the ocean from
Yeah.
more CO2, and things like air pollution, which ultimately comes from burning fossil fuels. But if we were successful, then it would be a little bit worse than there was no climate change. We can also adapt, of course, as it gets warmer. You install more aircon, you create cooling shelters, you can design crops that won't fail so much when there's a drought and things like that. But ultimately, we're going to be worse off because there's a cost to all of these things, no matter how successful they are. But all of these things also run a huge risk. So if we don't adapt properly, or that climate engineering fails, then you have one, you'll be significantly worse off, and that's getting worse, as it goes on. And then you also have these tipping points. So there's physical tipping points. So things where the Earth system just switches really quickly.
Yep.
Because it's hit a certain threshold. So this is things like monsoon seasons could completely change, within a matter of decades.
Right.
You could see rapid runaway melting of the frozen tundra, which releases even more methane and CO2 greenhouse gases. Breakdown of the Gulf Stream, you see that in climate disaster movies, which controls a lot of weather around the world. If that breaks down, then suddenly the weather changes relatively quickly. We're talking decades. So those are sort of physical tipping points in the climate system, which makes everything way worse than you could predict. And they're kind of, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, they're known unknowns.
Right.
So we know that they happen. We don't quite know at what warming stage they happen. Scientists are trying to figure that out. Then you've also got social tipping points. So remember, this is increasing pressure on lots of subsystems and regions around the world. When does that spill over into mass migration, conflict, economic collapse? From an investment banker perspective, and if you listen to Mark Carney talk, he talks about a Minsky moment. So this is when, finance isn't based on what happened in the past. It's based on what's going to happen in the future. And that's how you price shares or real estate or whatever it might be.
Right.
And if you suddenly realize that, your condo in Florida has no future, then very quickly that gets devalued.
Yep.
And that can lead to basically a credit crunch moment.
Yeah.
But it would be the carbon crunch. And if you run through the numbers, which I do in the book, it could be 10 times worse than 2009, the credit crunch in 2009, because of the huge amount of assets at risk, basically.
Right.
So sticking with fossil fuels, it could be okay if we get lucky, but at some point, probably it gets very bad.
Well, considering that the indications, and from different points in different directions, are that already we're hitting various reinforcing loops that are just compounding effects that are already, some would argue, are already showing negative impacts on people's lives. So I don't know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Climate change is already happening. Right?
Sure.
We're already over 1 degree warmer. There's already physical change taking place in terms of sea level rise, extreme weather, and those impacts. Climate change is already happening. We're already over 1 degree C warmer. We're already seeing more extreme weather, be that hurricanes, extreme precipitation, heat waves, forest fires. And we're seeing this gradual sea level rise as well.
Yeah, exactly. So in my excitement to chime in, what I wanted to say was to give you a name. And the name is, this guy's got the best name in the world, Thor Hansen. His name's Thor.
Thor Hansen.
Yeah, so he was on the podcast previously, a few episodes ago. And he's as a scientist trying to sort of show people, well, how is climate changing right now, and how is it manifesting in the biosphere right now?
Yeah.
I'm going to use this moment as a perfect segue to, or just a instant to move on to the last image, which is, I think, a perfect way to promote your book and to promote your ideas. Are you down?
Yeah, let's do it.
So this is I've had various authors already. Right now, it's a cluster of scientists and thinkers and speakers on climate. But I've had various authors previously, and in this image is the graphical representation of your book cover. both front and back. The spine is it's black and white, and it says climate change and the road to net zero. Your first name isn't there on your front on the spine. Is it because
It's too long.
you're
It's
too
not double
long?
barrel surname.
Dude! So Matthew, yes, so climate change and the road to net zero. The cover has a very... Now, would somebody listening to this or reading your book, because the byline is science, technology, economics, politics, right? This is a very anthropocentric kind of understanding of climate change. And I guess climate change really is humans' fault. And so maybe the scope of your book really is human impact. So talk to me about your book. Like talk to like a listener listening to this. Let's pitch your book, because how do we get them to really understand that they have to go out there right now and get this book?
Well, I don't know if I'm a great salesman, but we'll come to that in a minute. You picked up on a really good point there. You're talking about it's human centric,
Yeah.
right? So, starting out on this journey, I was always very adamant this was going to be fairly human centric,
Okay.
because you can go out there and you can read lots of books by climate science, which are great, by the way, but great book, and I review them all on my blog and website. Great books by climate scientists and environmentalists who are passionate about, solutions to climate change, because they're passionate about the environment and nature. And and there's some great, there's some amazing books out there. But I thought going into this, well, that's great, and that's going to be read by environmentalists and naturalists and people who are already concerned about nature and the environment. But those aren't the people who need convincing of this, right?
Right.
So they're already taking action. They're already hopefully
Motivated.
changing their lifestyles to accommodate climate action. This book needs to be aimed at those who are on the other side of the coin, who are, maybe they don't believe in climate change because they haven't seen the data presented non-biasedly, fairly. Maybe they believe in climate change, but they think it's all too difficult to take action. They don't understand how, or it's going to cost too much. So all of these kind of arguments against. So, and to address those, I think you had to address it from a very human perspective.
Right.
So, kind of one thread that runs through the book is the the two sides of the argument. So what I call doom and boom. So at one extreme you have the group of people who believe that the planet is doomed because of all of this human influence which is happening. And it's not just climate change, but there was lots of things before that, concerns about population, concerns about consumption, concerns about Karl Marx and concentration of capital in the hands of the few. These arguments have been running on for hundreds of years. On the other hand, you've got kind of so that's this is the limits to growth argument. On the other side, you've got those who just fundamentally believe in the power of human innovation, in free markets finding best alternatives, everything getting priced in, and we'll kind of get through it in that way, and we can go on growing and consuming and progressing. And so there's I frame this around a bet. There's a really good book called The Bet by Paul Sabin as well, who talks about this. But this is a bet between, this was in the 1970s, and there's a sort of celebrity biologist called Ehrlich, and a economist called Julian Simons. And they basically, on one side, Ehrlich thinks that the world is going to face oblivion within decades because of population growth. On the other side, Simons thinks that no, because markets are going to sort this out. We'll find substitutes, we'll find alternatives, and we'll get through it.
Right.
And they basically took a 10-year bet on whether a basket of raw materials would go up in price or down in price.
Okay.
So this was that, which may sound like a dull bet, but in fact it was a bet over the kind of future of human civilization.
For sure.
And that, I think, really illustrates the back and forth arguments that happen on climate change very nicely. By the way, it was the economist who won the bet in the end.
They always do. But
it's both are wrong and both are right. There is, and a lot of this is, feedback loops, right? If you start worrying about something, it starts getting ingrained into politics and culture. We start to do something about it. So you need the worriers. You also need the guys who are saying, hey, don't worry, we can innovate. Let's come up with solutions. So you need everybody creating that culture.
I have to chime in with a few dangling points. One, when I referenced Gun, Germs, and Steel, just remembered the author was Jared Diamond. And if you haven't read his book, it's an interesting, because he also looks at, well, what were the economics that humans were able to, not economics, but what were the factors that led to humans succeeding so well? And he kind of explains it from a very, very different angle, not climate change. That's one thing.
Yes. I would add to that, Angus Maddison.
Okay.
Angus Maddison is an economic historian.
Right.
So he will walk you through kind of average incomes of average human beings and how they change through time and why.
Right. Which is important, which is totally important.
Yeah. So in the same, it's similar vein.
Yeah. You're in London, I'm in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is way more, I don't know, commercial. And I could just imagine you working on the other end of a line, speaking with Americans who are just like, nah, listen, it's all about economics. It's all about, I can totally imagine those conversations. So what's next? Okay, so what is the incarnation of that book now in your life, and how is that being expressed?
So the book was kind of a launch pad for me. Number one, what it was to convince me on the best course of action. And the outcome of that is, back to the previous image, is reaching net zero and doing it quickly. So I actually, if you run the maths on all of this stuff, I think a 20-year transition to eliminating greenhouse gases and reaching net zero will be the optimum outcome for the world. So that's kind of what I'm doing now, is working towards that goal.
Okay.
And that's because it'll avoid the worst impacts of climate change. It's cheaper. It avoids all those damages, less air pollution, and all there's 8 million people die from that every year. That's a big co-benefit. It'll also create more jobs, and it'll create a less volatile energy system. So everything's summed up on that last slide.
Right.
So what I'm doing now is I set up a consultancy business. So I do anything and everything. So I've taken a bit of a sort of yes man approach. Is that Jim Carrey? I think it's Jim Carrey. You just sort of, I've just been saying yes to everything that comes my way, following the book.
Sweet.
So we see where it happens.
No, hey, wait, look, I was given one of the nicest compliments when this guy that I just met and we went traveling together and everything, he's like, Ran, you're kind of like, you say yes to everything. And that's one of the important values that I have, right? Like, we only have one life. How do we make every second count? As far as I'm concerned, my recipe is say yes to everything. Sí a todo, sí a todo. Like, say yes to the world. So let's end on a high note to kind of motivate a listener to, of course, get the book, Climate Change on the Road to Net Zero. And if they love your accent, can they hear you speak at other places or read your work?
So I run a blog and a website. www.net-zero.blog.
Okay.
So on there, you've got videos of the book, 15-minute video with the summary of the book. You've got blogs on there, infographics.
Fantastic.
I've got a bookshelf where I review other climate books, which people like. And then I'll be building that out into a sort of another branch of it will be the consultancy website,
Yeah.
where I'm going to be reviewing great companies doing great things for climate change, basically. So I hope it becomes a kind of hub on everything climate related, basically.
Wicked. Okay, Matthew, you know what? Okay, spoiler alert, or shall I say, let's have no cliffhangers, right? So from your honest, sober, intellectual best opinion, are you an optimist for the next 20 years?
I'm not going to answer that question. 100%. Everybody asks me, so when do you think we'll reach net zero? Do you think we can do this?
I love it.
I'm going to tell you what I think is the best course of action.
Yeah.
Is reaching net zero in 20 years.
Yeah.
Because this is about scaling up. It's not about the passing of time. So I don't want to make time predictions anymore.
Yeah.
I'm not a stock picker anymore.
Ah.
I don't need to do that. What I want to be now is part of that kind of self-fulfilling cycle, or influence, I guess, a climate influencer, right?
Right.
Getting people moving faster towards that 20-year target.
You are an optimist. I love it. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I will definitely, people can check out the book and people can check out the website, and hopefully once the consultancy is up and running, get you on board, because you're a good man. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Oh, it's up and running already.
Oh, great.
It's happening. So, well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I'm sure we'll catch up in the future. So
Fantastic.
Thank you for having me on.
Matthew, thank you.
Shooting it raw?
Yes. Shooting it